May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts make you glad, O God. Amen. You've already had so many good texts for what I'm going to try to say briefly today about remembering sky and about loving animals. And Marlon pulled out from her Bible one of the bookmarks in her Bible, which is Jesus surrounded by sheep. And surely many of you have seen that over the years. And also right up here, this window with Jesus with the sheep around his neck, carrying it. So let me just refer you back a second to the meditation quote on the front of your bulletin, which is a story about sheep. And it's a story about fat sheep. And I want to make sure you have it in your mind, as well as the song, as well as Marlon's testimony, as well as the text that was read. So in this series on the environment, we have been laying out what can only be called very obese ideas. You might think of this as a review session to start with. What we've been trying to say in different ways is this. For the last 4 centuries or so, we have learned to think about nature instrumentally. It's there to feed us with its plants and its animals, and warm us with its wood and its oil. We have come to imagine ourselves as its point and its pinnacle, the place it was going. Nature is not human nature, though. We've been trying to say so much as nature is nature. The independence of nature was long prefigured in the scriptures. You heard it. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Get over it. The earth belongs to God. And when we confuse God's nature as human nature, we go straight for the jugular with God. And going for God's jugular is the diabolical idolatry of self-obsession. Or, here Ezekiel, again, attacking modern thought. It's a fascinating text. I'm not sure I'd ever really seen it before. It's about nature's utility. The prophet says, is it not enough for you to feed on the good pasture, but you must tread down with your feet the rest of the pasture? When you drink of clear water, must you foul the rest with your feet? And must my sheep get your leftovers? God must have been reading Michael Pollan. Instead, you see, of a sanctified landscape, we live in a sanctimonious landscape, placing ourselves so deeply inside it that we can no longer really see outside. We can't even see the land that is there. Sanctified experience on the land comes when we get ourselves out of the way and see nature as nature and land as land. Now, just a couple of examples. A sanctified experience might come to you if you were watching the new show in the gym, Women of Will, and all of a sudden a mouse goes running across the floor. By the way, they've named the mouse Geraldo, which I think is a good moment. When you see that mouse, instead of getting out the traps, you might marvel at the very idea of a rodent. Or you might, in a sanctified way, come to know that all dogs are not Lassie, nor all rabbits Bugs Bunny, or all deer Bambis. Thank you very much, Walt, but animals are not cartoons. When we become independently respectful of independent nature, we get our movies and our minds and our self-obsession out of the way. So today I want to try to extend these fat ideas about first and second nature, about nature and cities, about us and nature and cities, and claim just a little bit of new territory. I want to say that sanctified landscapes are a form of self-forgetfulness, what we might even call spirituality. They get us out of our way, and not just with nature, but with just about everything else. This spirituality or self-forgetfulness is more like a diet than anything I know. We eat less. We move more. We become lighter on the earth, psychologically, spiritually, and physically. It is the art of subtraction in a world that only knows addition. It's not a makeover so much as a make-under. And we recognize the danger and the obesity of Enlightenment ideas about nature. Now, you can approach the art of subtraction or weight loss with just as much self-obsession as you can approach obesity. So if you think I'm saying now that I want you to think about a spirituality of less in order to save the earth, you're still living in the old ideas. So you can be instrumental about instrumentality. You can turn almost anything into progressive pragmatism, including nature. See, I don't want you to consume less as a way of saving yourself or the planet. There's a deep trap there. Each is finally sneakily self-referential. Sneakily self-referential. You're not out yet. Nature's not nature until it is allowed to live on its own terms and allowed to die on its own terms, absent and exempt the human preoccupation with itself. I've been mightily impressed with the nature writer Elizabeth Goodenough. I love her name. It really is Goodenough, but it also writes as good enough. She urges us to live outside the sanctity of the self, into the sanctity of surprise. Her best words, I think, are these: I am in constant, outrageous celebration that any of it happened at all in the first place. That any of it happened at all in the first place. That surprise in her makes space, open space, for unsanctimonious sanctity. Or think of another great nature writer, also a great urban poet, Walt Whitman, who so much of what he writes is newly prescient and beautiful, but he has one that I just love. He says, I sing the body electric. And in it, he marvels at the electricity in the animal body, the synapses that let our bodies digest, come in, let go, take out, and deliberate. He stands in awe of nature and sees the very leaves of the very grass. Or hear another new nature writer, Elaine Scarry, talk about nature. She defines it as contact with the beautiful and a covenant with awe. She says that beauty is an affective, emotional experience where we are moved by something larger and other than ourselves. Continuing with her, the beautiful de-centers us. It takes us off our center into a larger and more vast center. Aldo Leopold calls this an intense consciousness of the land, so large that you feel beautifully small and inconsequential. In this series, we have been trying to decenter and recenter ourselves. We've been trying to encourage you to be a John Muir in New York, or a Henry David Thoreau in Manhattan. We've been trying to say that there's a wilderness here and a wildness here, and we just need to see it. We've been saying that New York is an ocean-fronting region not a Thoreau-facing pond. Why? Because we know we've already lived into the apocalypse and know that we now dwell beyond our own limits. I remember debating Ed Koch, of blessed memory, in the 80s. He wanted to get rid of the urban gardening movement. Couldn't afford it. Fascinating idea. I remember writing a piece for the Brookings Institute in Miami when I was there. They said, come up with a really wild and crazy idea. And I said, okay, let's get rid of every other road and plant gardens there. And the woman who had commissioned the piece passed out and said, that will get me fired. I didn't want you to be absurd. I want to just have an idea. And last year they published that utopian idea. So what difference could all these big, fat, obese ideas make to you or my small life? First, I want to say, and I'm going to do this briefly, way too briefly, you could declare what Stephen Gluckstern calls eminent domain over your own spirituality. Gluckstern, by the way, is a friend of Judson, used to live down the street. His wife was one of the founders of GLAAD nationally. They moved to San Francisco, and he has an idea that is as good as the Rolling Jubilee, and it's in this week's New Yorker. Read the whole thing. It's complicated, but it basically says we're in such a crisis over mortgages and the environment that we have to get the banks out, that we are so over-mortgaged environmentally and economically that we have to declare eminent domain and let cities take up the mortgages. People have to pay, but the banks don't have to gain off the payment. So I want to take Gluckstern's idea about eminent domain, which is something you do when you really know there's a crisis. You do something big. And I want to use it spiritually. Declaring eminent domain over our own spirits is a serious confrontation with grief. How did I come to dwell in such a way as to foul the water and be fat in a world of skinny sheep? Those who can confront the grief of entrapment and understand the way the system is rigged will not just survive. That's not the point. Human survival is not the point. But we will at least be out of our own way. We will sanctify what is rather than try to fix it. We will connect to beauty. The grief confronted becomes a way to live differently, not instrumentally, but differently. So how would this matter to you this afternoon? You might take just a moment to imagine this truth. Things are not always going to be the same as they are right now. They're not. Look at the beauty of this agape feast, here, now, suggesting there and then. Imagine having to do this service in the dark, or without microphones, or without so much food, wonderful as it is. Imagine not waking up to the luxury of a hot shower. How many of us took a hot shower this morning? Things may not always be that way. And instead of worrying that, you might spend a moment rejoicing that any of it ever happened at all. When we release ourselves from the self-centered picture of nature, we move beyond self-induced entrapment into a kind of freedom, the kind the dinosaurs knew, the kind we might also know, and know as beauty and as joy. Amen.